Hi everyone, welcome to Urban Harvest STL's first virtual workshop, Vermicompost 101 with the Urban Worm Company. We're so glad you're here with us today to learn a little more about our latest obsession, worms. We have attendees joining us from around the country, so before we start, we wanted to share a little bit about Urban Harvest STL. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to creating a more equitable food system in St. Louis, Missouri. We do this by growing fresh produce across a network of urban farms in the heart of the city and donating the majority of our harvest to communities with limited or non existent access to healthy food. During a typical season, we invite people to our farms to get their hands dirty as volunteers, to learn about urban agriculture and food insecurity on farm tours, and to support our mission at fundraising events such as happy hours and harvest dinners. Our workshops are typically interactive experiences where we bring experts to our food roof farm so that they can share their knowledge about a particular topic related to gardening, health, sustainability, and more. COVID-19 has stopped us from bringing you to our farms in person, but it has given us the opportunity to reach out to experts and audiences beyond St. Louis. We're excited to be partnering with the Urban Worm Company, a Philadelphia-based vermicompost business run by Steve Churchill. Steve is dedicated to making the practice of worm composting a little less intimidating for beginners and helping enthusiasts realistically scale their efforts. We're thrilled that Steve agreed to do this workshop with us, and we can't wait to dive into some great content. Please post any questions in the comments below by midnight tonight, May 16th, so that we can compile them into a Q&A for Steve to respond to. Now, without further ado, let's get started.
Hey guys, my name is Steve Churchill. I am the owner of the Urban Worm Company out here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I became acquainted with Urban Harvest in St. Louis a few months back. They ended up buying a few of my products, and then I ended up donating to the organization. We sort of talked to each other a little bit, and especially in this time of COVID and social distancing, I know that they cannot do actual in-person workshops like they normally do. So we talked and we said, hey, let's do something virtual. And so I said, let me just go ahead and film for you guys a kind of a virtual workshop about vermicomposting. Now, some of you may have heard of vermicomposting before. It's also called worm composting. And it is a really, really awesome thing. I got into it about 7 or 8 years ago. I enjoy it. I think it's a wonderful form of recycling. The byproducts are awesome. In a weird way, it's a little addicting once you get into it because it's just amazing what these worms do. So what we're going to talk about today is the basics of vermicomposting and the benefits. We're going to talk about the benefits of the vermicompost itself, talk about how you can maintain a worm bin in your home on a budget especially. Then we're going to talk about how to maintain this bin going forward and really trying to help you avoid some of the mistakes that I see people make literally all the time. I answer emails week after week and it's almost all the same mistakes that people are making. So we're going to try to cover all those things today. This is going to be informal. You're going to see me probably take sips of coffee and whatnot along the way. It's about 7:30 in the morning here, so forgive me. But I am looking forward to talking to you about this wonderful practice of vermicomposting. So let's just start with the definition. Vermicomposting is the consumption and decomposition of organic matter via an ecosystem of microbes and earthworms, and it creates something called vermicompost. Some people call it worm castings as well. They're really kind of different, but for the purposes of today, let's just consider them to be the same. Now, by microbes, we mean things like bacteria and fungi and nematodes, things that we cannot see. But these are little animals. And what we are doing in a worm bin or with vermicomposting is trying to increase the amount of microbes in that matter, which the worms then eat both the food and the microbes and creates this just wonderful soup of biologically rich stuff that we use to amend our soil. And it is one of those things, especially with today's modern farming techniques that use this high levels of synthetic nitrogen. What it does is it's great for the plant, but it's terrible for the soil. And so what we're actually doing is helping to revitalize the soil. And just a little bit goes a long way, to be honest with you, but just a little bit will revitalize the soil in your your potted plants or your raised beds outside or wherever you want to apply this vermicompost. The process of vermicomposting is really awesome, I think, because there's so many benefits. The first benefit is on the what I call the input side of it, which is the fact that you don't actually have to send this organic waste away to a landfill. There's a couple awesome things about that. So what we typically put in a worm bin is paper and cardboard waste, which isn't heavy. But we also put food waste, which is heavy because of all of the water content. So food waste is typically 80 to 90% water. Now, by being able to recycle this in a worm bin at home, we reduce the weight that we are putting on that carbon burning truck to take it away from our homes, and we can handle it in our homes right there. So we're eliminating that part of the waste stream. The other part is that food waste, which is a huge fraction of the overall waste that we put in landfills. When it rots, it emits methane gas, and methane gas is far worse than carbon dioxide. In fact, methane gas traps anywhere from 84 to 100 times, depending on the study you look at it, 84 to 100 times the heat of carbon dioxide, which is amazing because we think of carbon dioxide, that's, we're trying to reduce the emissions. Methane is far, far worse than carbon dioxide. Most methane comes from larger scale, really oil production and agricultural, agricultural methods. But look, we can do what we can in the home, and this is one awesome way to do it. So we, again, reduce the amount of carbon that we're producing by shipping this stuff away from our homes. We're able to reduce the methane in the landfill. The other benefit of vermicomposting is just simply the fact that we get to create this awesome fertilizer at home, and we don't have to spend money on synthetic fertilizers at the store, which again takes a lot of energy to create at a factory and then to ship to you. So, we don't have to send it away to landfill, but then we also don't have to go get this synthetic fertilizer. We can create this stuff at home. So that is the awesome part about vermicomposting, the process. Now, vermicompost, the product, basically the end product of vermicomposting, is awesome as well. We talked about how it can revitalize the soil and add life to soil, and that's true, but it has a lot of other awesome things that it does to the soil and to the plants. So to the soil, again, adds those microbes to the soil. It also increases water retention. It increases aggregation as well, and this is important because you've got different particles of different things like clay and silt that are in soil. The vermicompost or the worm castings basically helps those things bind together and gives the soil structure. This helps increase drainage and again water retention at times, and it's just it's wonderful for the soil. Now, for the plants, it does things like increases root growth, increases plant growth, it makes germination, basically the process of the seed kind of sprouting, makes that happen more quickly. You get higher yield, you get better pollination, you get better pest and pathogen suppression in soils that are treated with vermicompost. Now, I won't go into all about how that happens, just trust me, there are tens of thousands of peer-reviewed scholarly articles about the effects of vermicompost, and they're wildly varying, but the scientists know that this good stuff is happening. So we want to talk about how we can do this at home, and this is something that this is something that can be done by spending a little bit of money or spending next to no money. And really, the cool part is that at its bare bones, vermicomposting could actually literally be done in a pile inside your house or inside your garage. Now, granted, your roommates and husbands, wives, partners would not really care for that. So we're going to talk about how to do it in a container that you likely already have in your house. So I'm going to get a coffee break here, and then we'll get started. Okay. So the cool part about vermicomposting is that it can be done using some very common household materials, and it can be done on a budget. And the only thing you may need to buy are the composting worms themselves, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. One of the most common things that beginning vermicomposters and even experts, to be honest with you, will use is a Rubbermaid bin. These bins are inexpensive. It's likely that you may already have them in your home, and really that is just the single container that will work for a worm bin. Now, this particular bin, if you sort of see how deep it is, this is an 18-gallon Rubbermaid bin. You can get 10-gallon Rubbermaid bins that actually have the same surface area. They're just a little shallower, and that would actually be a little bit better because vermicomposting is a surface area dependent process. What happens is that the earthworms really are only working in the top 6 to 8 inches of whatever their habitat is. You may find them lower if it's really wet lower because they're attracted to moisture, but in most cases they're going to be found really in that top layer of the fresher organic waste. So really a lot of this space that you see kind of from here down to here is a little bit wasted. So a 10-gallon Rubbermaid bin actually provides you the same surface area, which is about 2 square feet, as this bin. What the first thing you're going to do with a bin like this, or you could even use a 5-gallon bucket, is to take a drill with a drill bit, and you're just going to drill holes. This one already has it, as you can see, but we're just going to drill a whole bunch of holes in the side to provide ventilation for the worm bin. And then what we're going to do is we're going to fill basically a base layer of bedding. Now, bedding is a carbon-rich substance, and that's a little bit technical. But just think of bedding as things like paper, cardboard. I really like coconut core. You have to buy it, but I find it's kind of a least risk form of bedding. But essentially, bedding is anything that you could put on your floor inside your house and leave it for a couple days, and you're not worried about it rotting. Things that are high in nitrogen, you would worry about rotting. Things that are high in carbon, you would not. So think of that shredded paper, shredded cardboard. That is going to form the bedding layer in your worm bin. And it's going to form kind of the base layer, I should say, because you're going to be adding bedding as you go on. And one thing I want to say about bedding here real fast is that when you think of other animals with bedding, it's not stuff that they eat. So if you have hamsters, gerbils, reptiles, or whatever, and you've got bedding, that bedding is really not something that has to be continually, you might have to refreshen it, but you don't have to constantly add it. With a worm bin, you do need to be constantly adding bedding because it is also really a food for the worms. That is still an organic material that is going to break down. So anyway, I've described bedding. You're basically going to put about a 6-inch layer of bedding in here. You're going to want to make sure that it is moist. I like to say that if you're using paper or cardboard, you want to let that stuff soak overnight and wake up, basically wring it out as much as you can, and then place it into the bottom of your bin. And so once you have that, then what I would actually do, and this is before we even put any worms in here, is I would take a small amount, and I mean small, like an apple core, banana peel, something like that. Take it, put it into the bin. And what we're doing here is actually providing food for microbes to thrive. And you're gonna start with pretty much a sterile sort of bin like this, but then after you add that stuff, the microbes are gonna start to colonize it. And what we're doing is sort of creating that initial food source for the worms before we ever put the worms in there. And I would say that once your bedding layer is in here and you have put some of that organic waste in there, go ahead and cover this thing up and then let it sit there for several days. Anywhere from 2 to 7 to 14 days is probably good. This will also allow time for that moisture that's in there to sort of equalize, because not everything is going to be equally moist. So the longer that we can give it, the more time that we can give it, kind of the more preparation that we can do for when we finally get the worms. So let's talk about those worms, because this is another, I would say, misconception with a lot of vermicomposters. So there are something like 7,000 to 9,000 different species of earthworms in the world. Only about 5 of them, maybe 7, are any good at composting, which is really crazy when you think of it. And there's really only 2 that I would recommend that you start with. And of that, I have one favorite, and that's called the red wiggler, or the nerd name for it is Eisenia fetida. So the red wiggler is what I kind of call the, I don't know, Honda Accord or Honda Civic of composting worms, in that it's not sexy, but it's a good, it's a good vehicle for you. It's a good way. It's a good worm that is actually, I would say, appropriate for most conditions, and especially around St. Louis. You've got a temperate climate there. It gets pretty cold in the winter, it gets pretty hot in the summer. You're going to want something that can adapt to a large range of conditions, temperature-wise especially, and that would be the red wiggler. You normally have to buy these online, or purchase from somebody that sells them locally. These are not worms that you're going to find in the ground. These are the weird kind of worms that actually don't like soil. They actually live kind of above the soil, but below loose matter like manure or leaf litter. And even if you went to a manure pile or went in the forest and dug up and got the worms that you saw underneath, those may not even be red wigglers. So you're probably going to have to buy those. And I would expect to pay somewhere between $35 a pound or so. Sometimes that includes shipping, sometimes it doesn't, but those are the worms that I would start with. Now you're probably wondering, how many worms do I need to get? Well, something like this is about a little over a foot, and this is a little under 2 feet. So we're talking about 2 square feet of surface area. I would say starting with a half pound to a pound is appropriate for most people. Now that is actually below the maximum capacity that you would get with a system like this. You might get up to 2 pounds per square foot in a bin like this, but we don't want to start that way because the worms are really, you want them to get acclimated. What you don't want to do is actually spend $80 on worms and then kill them all like I did when I first started out. So take it slow. Get just a half pound to a pound of worms, and we'll get started from there. So once your bin is prepared and you're all ready for the worms, really it's time to just sort of throw them in your bin, and they'll work things out on their own. Now, what you want to do in the beginning is actually, when you put them in the bin, you want to shine a bright light over the top of the bin, and what that does is it forces the worms down into the bedding. Worms do not like light, they're repelled by it, and so we want to sort of force them down into the bedding to let them get acclimated. Otherwise, it's kind of a shocking experience to be transplanted to a new place, and the worms will just probably try to leave. So we want to take that bright light, stick it over the top of the bin, and then probably want to do that for the first day or two. After that, you can cover up the bin, whether it's the lid that you get with the bin or a towel or something like that, and then from there you should be good to go. I would actually not consider feeding too much. Maybe just a sprinkling, just a little bit of organic waste. The ratio I tell people when it comes to how much you should feed your worms is about, I'm going to say 25% of the worm weight that you put in. So if you get 1 pound of worms, I would put in about a quarter of a pound of food waste, and this is what they say in theory that you can do daily. Now, I would not be following any sort of just set like, oh, I can feed a quarter pound a day and I'm good. You need to make sure that you monitor conditions in the bin. If you start seeing things like fruit flies or mold or things growing, you're either overfeeding or you're not adding enough bedding. So we're going to kind of get to the maintenance part of it here in a bit, but in terms of how much that you feed, you want to feed very little at first until you actually see the worms really start to proliferate, start to thrive, start to reproduce, and your nose is also going to tell you when things are going bad, because if it's starting to rot in there, then it will get stinky. So that brings up like the next thing of what should we be feeding the worms, and that part That part is a little bit, it's sort of simple, but there's a few restrictions that you should know about. So in general, you want to be feeding non-meat, non-dairy food waste. So you don't want meat, you don't want cheeses, milk. I would stay away from grains. I would only do citrus as well really in moderation. I'll just run off a list of things that I know are great in worm bins: apple cores, banana peels, cantaloupe, watermelon. Really anything that's pumpkin. My goodness, in fall they go nuts for pumpkin. It's amazing. Coffee grounds are good. Now I will say one thing about coffee grounds is that fresh coffee grounds are actually sterile because you've just run them through scalding hot water. But after they start to the microbes will recolonize them, and then the worms will really take to that stuff. So basically any vegetable waste, like cauliflower or broccoli, those are good things to put in there. So again, just stay away from the meats, the dairies, and really kind of, if you think of everything in moderation to include the quantity, that will keep you safe. Another coffee break. So maintaining a bin is actually really pretty easy once you get up and going. I consider starting a worm bin sort of like starting a fire, where it's kind of hard to start in the beginning, but then once it's going, it's really easy to keep going. And the three factors that you need to manage, and there's really only two that we're going to talk about, is moisture, temperature, and pH. pH, don't even worry about that. The pH in your bin is probably going to be fine if you manage the other two things. So let's talk about temperature first. Worms are living creatures. They're fleshy animals just like you and me. They typically like to operate in the same temperatures that we do. So anything from about 50 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit is perfectly safe for the worms. Any departures outside of that you can tolerate for a little bit, but you want to keep it in that 50 to 90 degree range. So you want to, if you can, try to keep your worm bin inside, or at the very least sheltered from the elements. Maybe if you have a garage, inside of a garage or a utility room. It doesn't necessarily have to be heated, but the closer to the house that you can make it, the better. And keep in mind, for the temperature, it's not the temperature outside that matters. I mean, that does matter, but it's the temperatures inside the bin. And because we have this thriving ecosystem of worms and microbes, they actually kind of create their own heat a little bit. So especially in things like the wintertime, there are people I know that are in the St. Louis area that have worm bins that they literally keep outside their door. And things keep working for them over the winter because that heat that is created from inside the worm bin, and we're not doing hot composting here, understand, it's just the heat that it's almost like the heat that you get when you're in a crowded room. It's coming from all the people, it's coming from all the organisms that are in that room. That same sort of thing happens in a worm bin. So it's the temperatures in the worm bin that matters, not really the temperatures outside. So the other thing too is the larger the worm bin you have, and this maybe speaks to why maybe you do want a lot of volume with, say, the 18-gallon bin versus the 10-gallon bin, is that you can trap more heat and sort of provide a buffer against temperature extremes if you have more volume. So I know I said that vermicomposting is surface area dependent, and it's true, but there is some benefit to having volume when it comes to managing the heat. The other thing, and this is really the big one that we need to manage, is moisture. When you are putting food waste in a worm bin, you are putting water in a worm bin. And what happens is, over time, is that food waste that you put in there in your bin doesn't feel wet, but there is a ton of water that's trapped within the cell walls. So as the food waste breaks down, the cell walls rupture and it releases water. And this is why you could overfeed a worm bin. You basically would put a big feeding in there, think everything is fine, it doesn't look wet at all, and you come back the next couple days and it's like this soupy mess. That is because your food waste broke down, released that water, and essentially overwatered your bin. So We want to make sure that we prevent that by being very patient, especially in the beginning. Be very patient with the amount of food that you're putting in there. Again, maybe only a quarter of the worm's weight. I wouldn't even do that every day at first. I might do that once every 5 days, once every week. See how the worms are handling it. That way you're also controlling the amount of water that you're putting in your bin. The other thing that you want to do is make sure that there's a lot of bedding in there, and that bedding is going to sop up that excess moisture and prevent what we call leachate or leaching, where all that water cannot be absorbed by all the material around it. And what happens is it makes its way to the bottom of the bin, and especially if you're using a Rubbermaid bin, you would kind of never know it. We want to prevent that for a couple reasons. One, it makes it hard to harvest the castings later because you've got this like soupy mess. It's just hard to screen away the castings from the other material. The other reason is that you are actually going to be attracting your worms kind of lower in the bin at times too. Worms are very attracted to moisture. As that material breaks down or as the organic material breaks down and the water kind of goes to the bottom, the worms often go down to the bottom with it. And we don't want that, because we want to kind of keep them up in the top few inches where they can process that new food waste that we're putting in our bin. The other thing that happens with that water, that leachate, is that it drains down and it occupies what's called pore space in your compost or your vermicompost. What pore space is just little air pockets that's in your material. And what happens is that water goes down, displaces the air that is in these pore spaces. The microbes then consume the oxygen that is in that liquid, and then you are left with a oxygenless or anaerobic vermicompost, which can be stinky. The worms seem to be okay with it, but it is when you have a worm bin that is stinky, it's basically because it has become anaerobic, typically because it is way too wet. So we control this, again, one of two ways, is that we control the amount of food waste that we're putting in there, but we also make sure that when we put the food waste in there that we are putting that bedding in there, which can help sop up that excess moisture. Okay, so I've written down some, I call this the FAQ troubleshooting, just general tip section of this virtual workshop. So I want to cover, again, just some things that are really common questions that I get and things I think are going to help you on your journey with vermicomposting. So the first, I'll just call it question, is the juice at the bottom of your worm bin worm tea? And for those of you that have seen those things with the taps, is that tea? And no, that's not tea, that is leachate. Worm tea is actually a deliberately brewed tea where you basically take vermicompost and you put it inside of a bucket and you agitate the water with a bubbler, and you sort of create this extract that you can use on your plants. That stuff that you get, the juice that just drips out of the bottom of an overly wet worm bin, is called leachate. You can use it on your plants, but I would not use it on any edible plants. Can I put garden worms in my worm bin? And I know we talked about in the first section about how many different species there are, and that there are only 5 composting species of earthworms. So no, you could put them in your bin, but they're not going to thrive in your bin. So the worms that you dig out of the soil are not going to be the kind of worms that you would put in your worm bin. And conversely, you would not want to take red wiggler compost worms and then dump them in your soil and expect them to burrow. They're not muscular enough. They are not going to dig down and create those burrows and the protection for themselves. They're basically going to become bird food. So don't put composting worms in the garden, and don't put garden worms in your compost bin. You might encounter fruit flies at some point, and mites. These indicate conditions that are way too wet. And again, this is a common theme, is to maintain the moisture in that bin. Fruit flies are attracted to wet and fermenting conditions. The larvae are often on the food waste when you put it in your bin. So that's often how they get in there in the first place. With mites, they are attracted to very wet conditions. So you would find them very commonly if you were to put watermelon or some really high water content food in your bin. You often see mites that are in there. They are really more a nuisance than anything else. They are actually effective decomposers, so they're really not that bad of a thing to have in your worm bin, except that they indicate the conditions have got a little bit wet. If you don't mind having them in there, it's not like you need to take them out, but they do indicate that things may be a little bit too wet. If you have ants in your bin, this is a much less common problem. This indicates that things are too dry. If you have ants or any other hard-shelled pests, one way to actually get rid of them, again, with ants, it's more about the dryness, so just make it more moist and they should go away. But if you have beetles or arthropods or hard-shelled pests, one thing that you can do is add a substance called diatomaceous earth. This is basically the crushed, fossilized remains of something called diatoms, which is this microscopic organism. Basically, what this diatomaceous earth does is it's abrasive to the shells that are on the outside of these pests, and what it makes them do is basically dehydrates them because it etches the outside of their protective covering. So that's a way to get rid of hard-shelled pests or ants, is with diatomaceous earth. You want to make sure, though, that it is food-grade diatomaceous earth, or else it will be harmful to the worms. Let's see here. How do I know when to feed? Well, when you feed is often, it's often going to be you looking at your bin and seeing that the worms have actually processed the food that you've already put in there. So if you see food that looks like it hasn't been touched, then it's not time to feed. One way that I can tell when it's time to feed is that the top of the bin looks almost like a pool table. It's almost fuzzy. What that fuzz is basically the worm castings, and it should be a very smooth surface. And actually, I think if you got in your bin and you saw that very smooth surface and you just scrape below the very top surface, you would see a ton of worms in there. That's, to me, tells me that it's time to actually start feeding again. So your eyeballs are going to tell you when it's time. And again, if you see a bunch of food in there that hasn't been touched yet, it's not time to feed. How do I know when to harvest? And this is a tough one, especially if you're doing it in a Rubbermaid bin like we described before. When you harvest is kind of up to you. I would say in most cases you will not have a harvestable amount of castings for about 4 months after you start, maybe even up to 6 months. And so the hard part is that as you are doing your composting in this bin, you're constantly adding stuff to it, so you're never really done. It's not like you have a completely finished bin. But what you might want to do is, once your bin gets full and you can kind of get that sort of pool table effect on the top of your vermicompost, then maybe it's time to harvest. And harvesting is a whole different ball of wax. What I would do, the easiest thing that I would do in this case, is I would just literally grab the top 6 inches of that material, place it into another worm bin, and then just use the remaining material, which should be mostly the worm castings. I would take that and I would just dump it in your garden. It's going to have some worms in it, of course. But it's just the easiest way for you to start a new bin and harvest the old castings is once you've got a finished Rubbermaid bin full of good worm compost, take the top layer, which is essentially going to have a ton of worms and some unprocessed material, stick it in another bin, take that first bin, and then put that stuff in your garden or wherever you want to use your worm compost. Let's see, what's next? If worms are escaping or appear to be escaping your worm bin, I want to make a distinction here. Some worms climbing up the side because the inside of your bin has condensation on it, that is one thing. And for the bin that I actually manufacture and sell, called the Urban Worm Bag, it's very common that it traps enough moisture that there is condensation that's coming off of the food waste, and it creates condensation on the bottom of the lid and along the side of the walls. the worms are going to explore that, and they're going to crawl up the sides, and they're going to like it. And but it's only going to be a few dozen at a time. If you have worms that are really congregating up at the top of your lid, or right underneath the lid of a worm bin, and they're trying to escape, then that indicates that something is wrong in your worm bin. Almost guarantee you it's because you overfed and there wasn't enough bedding. So we're back to the bedding part again. So what has probably happened is that conditions have gotten a little noxious in your worm bin. So how moist should it be? I know I talked about having it be moist but not wet, and you don't want it to be too wet. Well, I want to try to give you something to steer for. If you pick up your vermicompost and you squeeze it really hard and you get like 1 drop of water, that indicates about 70% moisture content, which is very appropriate for a worm bin. You might even want it a little bit drier than that. If you can pick up some of your vermicompost and squeeze it, and water literally drips down, then you need more bedding to sop up that excess moisture. If the top of your worm bin is like that, then I guarantee you the bottom of your worm bin is going to be even wetter than that. So, but as far as how moist you want it, basically like a damp sponge, where you grab it, and if you just squeeze it as hard as you can and you get like 1 or 2 drops out kind of between your knuckles, that would be appropriate. So yeah, that covers some very, very common questions. I know we're going to probably be doing a live Q&A with Urban Harvest and I after this, and you can ask more questions then, or you can send your questions into them. I'm not quite sure how it's gonna happen, but if you want to learn more, you can go to urbanwormcompany.com. I have at the top of the page, I've got basically the ultimate guide to vermicomposting. That will give you a really good idea of kind of how to get started. It's going to go into a little more detail than what I went into here today. And you can also join my email list, and I send out some helpful tips there as well. And anyway, thank you everybody for watching. Hope that you enjoyed this, found it informative. If there is a Q&A session that we're going to do after this, hope that you watch that or take part in it however way you can. So anyway, thank you for your interest in worm composting, and I hope to hear from you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.